it's evident from anyone that's been there that it is now a big tourist destination. But let's start with a couple of quotes. George Albert Smith said, "We came to this land because it was desolate, desert, and God-forsaken, and no mortal on earth would covet it." And Brigham Young said, "The Lord led us to these barren valleys, these sterile mountains, this desolate waste, where only the saints could or would live, and no other class of people on the earth would desire it." So that's the land no one wanted. I chose to focus on St. George and Panguitch because these are two communities settled in some of the most harsh, forbidding American landscapes. And I thought it would make a great story of sense of place and placemaking when landscape becomes a character in your story. Similar stories as far as settlement goes. I've got these streetscapes up, and I think it's striking how similar the streetscapes are of Main Street in Panguitch and St. George. So you start out almost the same. Brigham Young calls you to settle a place that no one wants, and there's nothing really to recommend it. And how do you create a sense of place? St. George's 300 settlers were surprised to hear their names called across the pulpit in the 1861 conference. But they immediately departed and drew lots for the land and set about clearing the land. Robert Gardner tells us, "Our first work was arranging the settlement to make fields and construct ditches, all of which was an uphill business because it was hard to get the water and the land to connect." Similarly, in Panguitch, they had an aborted settlement attempt in 1860s and got driven out by the snow. But they were called by Brigham Young. He told George Seavey to go down and settle, and Seavey put kind of a brusque invitation in the Deseret News in 1871. "All those who wish to go with me to resettle Panguitch Valley will meet me in Red Creek on the 4th day of March, 1871, and we will go over the mountain in company to settle that country." So they tackled it again as a matter of religious duty. But what did they find there? Well, St. George was hellishly hot, and Panguitch was unbearably cold. So they started interacting with the landscape and making their sense of place in two very different ways, but really with landscape as their central character. So one of the quotes from Brigham Young reinforces that the landscape was something they needed to confront and make their own. He said, "The idea may arise that this is a hard land in which to get a living. Now, I am very thankful for the land just as it is." Well, here's what Parley P. Pratt thought of it: "A wide expanse of chaotic matter." Not very friendly and not very exciting. It's not like a Midwest town where you go, there's a beautiful stream and a whole natural resource that you can exploit. In Panguitch, they were first really excited because they were next to mountain lakes and rivers and streams, and they could dig culinary wells. But they soon learned that the town's high elevation could bring frost at any month of the year. One of the historians wrote, "Freak storms and cold waves often strike in early autumns and drive us indoors. The snow will fall and we cannot see the fences for the snows and the drifts." Droughts had a marked effect upon this country, and it was an unusually short growing season. Panguitch is at about 6,600 elevation with a growing season of 70 days. St. George is at an elevation of 2,600 feet with a growing season of 6 months. So Panguitch definitely had the harder cold weather zone. As they created their streetscapes, they built the traditional things that most towns would build in placemaking. They built post offices and recreation halls and blacksmith shops. And again, you see the similarities in the built place and what it looks like. This is 1910 in both towns. No paved roads. But really, the story is one of battling the elements. A quote from Panguitch is, "We found deer and other game in abundance, but people suffered for milk, butter, grease of any kind, flour, meats of all kinds. Their crops failed to mature, and the land was immediately doused with this extra water when the snow fell. Despite the geographical hardships, the people of Panguitch rallied to stay. Although it was an arid and rocky region with a severe climate and sub-zero weather 7 months of the year and frost nearly every month of the year, the people have grown prosperous. Industry and perseverance has been their motto. St. George's original story is the 40-day baptism. This is when the town settlers had been there a few months and they had built their lean-tos and they had built their ditches and they had built their fields of their first initial plantings, and it was Christmas Day and the rain started to fall, and it fell for 40 days and 40 nights. And it's ironic because you think in a desert water is not going to be the problem, but it washed out every single thing that they had built. And Robert Gardner tells this great story about it. He says, during this ordeal by water, the unrelieved dampness failed seriously to dampen the high spirits of the group who were embarked upon this challenging adventure. We had a good time, for we were united in everything we went at in those days. The town was literally washed out and rebuilt more than 40 times after that in the next 30 years. Sometimes the dams would be washed out 3 or 4 times in a growing season. The intense heat of the Dixie summer, augmented by the lack of shade, adequate shelters, and the swarms of flies against which there was no protection, likewise contributed to the general feeling of despondency. So Brigham Young's solution to this despondency and to this struggle with the elements was to cause them to undertake an enormous building program. And that's why I put the pictures of the tabernacle and the temple up, because he really saw this as the solution. Well, if a place is getting destroyed by the landscape, we're going to build an even more affirmative place. And so these buildings, even though there were only 300 or 400 people, the tabernacle was supposed to seat 2,000. And I think that really established their community identity as something that was there to stay. And the temple, first temple in the West, first LDS temple in the West, gave them a sense of a community identity as a gathering place for the whole region. So it was almost as if Young told them that they would be able to be rewarded for taking on these difficult landscape challenges with some of the prizes of LDS socioeconomic culture. So Panguitch had its own building program and its own origin story. They took up building a tabernacle as well in 1880 out of adobe fired brick. But the most definitive origin story they tell is of the quilt walk. And the way they tell it is this. My husband's grandma, I'll tell you, would say, I never heard of the quilt walk. But this is all about making place, right? So the quilt walk story goes like this. It was a particularly frigid winter. The snow had come early and the wheat crops had failed to mature. They ran out of flour early. As the snow continued to fall, the isolated community was cut off. No hope of aid until the thaw. The starving settlers decided to send 7 men from Panguitch over the mountain to Parowan to get food for the hungry families. They had to abandon their yoke of oxen because the snow was up to their armpits. The only progress they could make over the frozen crusted snow was to lay quilts end to end, relaying them and walking across the quilts. And this drama became known as the quilt walk. They did get the supplies and they did rescue the town. But you can see that this is really what they took out of the landscape to say we can beat Mother Nature at her own game in this most challenging of circumstances. What I saw in researching these town settlements was nature was first their enemy, but it then became their tool. And once they got the hang of it, they did get a dam on the Virgin River, and they did harvest the timber in Panguitch, and they did build a dam at Panguitch Lake, and they enlarged it so they could cultivate and irrigate the streams. Wallace Stegner called them the shock troops of Zion because they had taken a beating in the Lord's name for a long time and they weren't about to be discouraged by nature. These settlers wanted civilization. They didn't want wilderness. They wanted towns and they wanted to look at least like Salt Lake, if not the East Coast. So when they looked at their surroundings and they saw the beautiful forest, they saw building materials. And when they looked at the sandstone and the lava rock, they saw building materials. And when they looked at the sagebrush, they saw that it had to be cleared so could plant crops. They weren't much for scenery in those days. They really saw it as a way to tame the landscape. They dug out of the snow, they blazed trails, they built roads. And really, a summary of this section of their existence was for 50 years, they did everything they could to valiantly tame nature, battle the elements, and survive and not have nature do them in. So imagine their surprise when in the 1900s, the country decided to value their desolation for desolation's sake. Zion was established as a national park in 1919, and there were 2,000 visitors that year. Bryce Canyon was established as a national park in 1928, and there were 20,000 visitors. So you can see the advent of the automobile, even from the 19-teens to the 1920s, brought tens of thousands of visitors to this area. At that time, St. George and Panguitch were still in the 3,000 to 5,000 population, and they didn't have paved roads yet. They still had the dirt roads. But a speech by the United States National Park Superintendent Stephen Mather said it very pointedly. The national parks are national museums. Their purpose is to preserve forever, in their original untouched condition, certain few widely separated examples of the American wilderness of the pioneer, unblemished by man's hand. And tourism historian David Lauder has pointed out the irony of this. The idea of a national park is you dispossess the people that are there to preserve it for the people that will come and see it. But given the context of these settlement stories for 50 years, that was somewhat jarring to the second generation of pioneers. So begins the endless tension that I see in southern Utah between those who live on the land and those who want to visit it. I love this quote from Pomeroy. This really describes what happened at the early 1900s time period after the first 40 or 50 years of existence in those southern Utah towns. So, St. George and Panguitch said to themselves, if tourism is what you want, tourism is what we will do. Each of them were still only one hard summer or one tough winter away from destruction. So they organized chambers of commerce, they organized Rotary, they organized the business and professional women's clubs, and they began to pursue tourism with the same fervor that they had originally used to carve out a town out of a forbidding landscape. The first order of business was an attitude adjustment. A really great quote from the Garfield County News in 1923. Let's all boost southern Utah. Do we all fully realize while we are sitting around thinking that other people are getting busy all around us, we have got to get together and boost every mother's son of us. Stick together and hold some meetings and see what we can do to keep Panguitch on the map. Don't stand around belly aching like a school kid. The next thing they had to do was reevaluate what they thought of outsiders. They hadn't had a lot of visitors before these parks came. And a Garfield County News article says, citizens generally should remember, as a rule, tourists are mighty nice people. Practically all of them members of the great American family. As they go along, they spend for food and touring, and their money is not to be spurned. And then they needed to reframe their view of their surroundings. This was no longer a landscape to tame, this was a landscape to celebrate. In a 1921 Washington County News article, they said, scenery is one of our biggest assets. We believe the dream of the southern Utah man has come true, and also the dream of the tourist who is looking for the most beautiful spot in the world. The irony of calling this the most beautiful spot in the world seemed to be lost in the hurry to just welcome the visitors. They also had to become advocates for tourism. Most of you are familiar with the State Publicity and Industrial Development Department that began running ads advertising Utah as a tourism destination. And Susan has done a great paper on that about branding Utah. This is an ad that they put in the Garfield County News. Take stock of yourself. How many tourist questions can you answer? Are you prepared to answer questions about distance and directions? Can you offer clean, attractive accommodations? It is up to you. So the towns had to become advocates for their own tourism. And then they also scripted their place by cleaning up their towns. One of the articles I found said, get rid of the shanties. There There are too many abandoned buildings in town, and all of the things they had worked so hard to build that first 50 years now had to be redone for the tourists. They also had to advocate, one of the phrases they used was get some gravy, get some of the gravy that's coming around. There's money for roads, there's money for beautification, and there's money for water projects, and now we need all of that. And so they became very good at getting those. By the end of World War II, both Highway 89 through Panguitch and Highway 91 through St. George were paved and passable. So I hope you get a sense that the fundamentals of the game changed after World War II for these two towns. Up until then, both towns were about the same population, St. George a little bit more because of the regional center, but really hovering around the few thousand mark. And then the growth trajectories diverged dramatically. And you see Panguitch staying around that mark really until today, and St. George being, as we know, 70,000 people. It's an analysis for another day as to why those growth trajectories diverged so much, but they were very similar, the towns were, in the way they tackled their reinvention after the war. After this first flurry of activity with attitudes, like I said, they became boosters in a more sophisticated way, and there are certain men in each community that were powerful enough to change the way the community were perceived. So Orville Hafen was a senator from St. George who started to talk about the warm winter sunshine, and I just thought that was a really ironic twist on the earlier narrative, which had been unrelenting sun beating down on us, ruining us, and now it's, hey, come see our sun, this is where the summer sun spends the winter. There were also some other innovative men at that time in St. George that had been away for the war and had seen the desert Southwest and had seen air conditioning and knew that this could be reinvented as the other Palm Springs. One of those men was Andy Pace, whose dad had run one of the first auto camps in St. George. Andy built the El Paso Lodge down there, and you can see he uses the motifs of the saguaro cactus and the sombrero and the cowboy hat. He's built fitting right into the placemaking of Phoenix and Las Vegas and Southern California. And he had another motel there called the Rugged West that was a little bit more Wild West motif. But this is when St. George started planting the palm trees. They're not native. They started planting the saguaro cactus. They're not native. They started building the golf courses, although the first golf course wasn't completed until the 1960s, but it was started in the 30s. And this was really the reinvention of it as a tourist mecca. Panguitch had a lot of the same ideas. They tried to invent their lake. Again, now it's not a source of water. It's a source of fishing, and it's a source of boating, and it's a place to build cabins. And the canyons are now calling them, instead of, as Ebenezer Bryce said, it's a hell of a place to lose a cow. They're not using it for ranching anymore. Now they're using it as a place to attract tourists. I think Panguitch's approach as a gateway city was a little bit more subtle than St. George because they really believed in their narrative that they could just advertise the scenery and people would come. Where St. George seemed to get on the bandwagon a little bit earlier, we're going to need more than just scenery. We might need a few things like golf courses. So really interesting to see how the boosters in both towns work their magic to reinvent. I thought this was a great illustration of modern day scripting of place. These are some photographs I took just recently in Panguitch. You know, where St. George adopted the desert Southwest motif, Panguitch really adopted the Wild West motif. And heritage, I read, was the way we want to tell our stories. And St. George wants to tell its story as a desert mecca. Panguitch wants to tell its story as a Wild West mecca. So they've got Butch Cassidy's birthplace, you know, it's nearby in Circleville. So they've got Butch Cassidy on their buildings. Most of the motels or businesses have a wagon in front of them or a wagon wheel. You can see John Wayne's cutout there on Main Street if you'd like to take your picture with him. And this Falls Front Jail is another picture opportunity there on Main Street. But this was the greatest of all down on the left. This used to be one of my favorite mom and pop motels that was little cottages, blue and white cottages with shutters. It's recently been recovered as log cabins to fit in more appropriately with the scripted place. I love that. So, using nature as a positive factor is perhaps the biggest irony that I saw in my exploration of placemaking, because St. George now advertises the very things that were the most trying to them in the early days. The appearances of their town are polished, and these are some quotes. St. George says the once scarce water resources are now best used for golf courses that feature breathtaking landscapes and fun, challenging holes in a golfer's paradise. The severe rock terrain is described as fiery colors and endless vistas giving way to a dreamy landscape. And the lonely canyons are a place to create a feeling of calm, contentment, and overwhelming joy. I just love the way they've packaged it, but it's so beautiful when you see it there. And they've had to go beyond just the normal things. They've created other distinctive things they're known for, like the marathon, like the Huntsman Senior Games. Panguitch, they are the same way. Instead of the snow being a bad thing, winter is a magical time of year. Fresh fallen snow glistens like diamonds under a warming sun. Quilt walk, warming sun. The waters of Panguitch Lake are advertised for boating and fishing with quality angling experiences surrounded by spectacular scenery. And, the other ways they've captured the Wild West are with rodeos, which are a traditional way to freeze the cowboy era and market it to the outside world in a palatable way. Panguitch says in their brochure, saddle up, partner, watch wranglers test their skills at rodeos, team roping, barrel racing, and cowboy action shoots. So both towns are very successful at this. If you read their internet comment pages, TripAdvisor or Yelp or something, you get the most amazing quotes about, oh, this is such a cute little cowboy town, and they were wearing Western wear, and they were doing this and that. St. George, this is the tidiest city we've ever lived in. It's so bike-friendly. People just rave about these very place-making things that the town fathers put in motion in World War II. St. George has got, like I said, the marathon and the Huntsman Senior Games. Panguitch has a hot air balloon rally and a Harley rally and an ATV rally and a motorcycle rally and a mountain bike rally. So they really have gone the extra mile in promoting not just scenery but recreation to the tourism world. And it's very interesting to see the amount of discussion that goes on in both these towns today about how best to market themselves. So both towns have now been tourist destinations much longer than they were ever agricultural communities. They're not subsistence communities anymore. These are thriving towns that will stay. It's interesting, though, that a lot of the descendants from the original pioneers still live there and still are in decision-making capacities in those towns. The mayor of St. George is Daniel MacArthur, whose great-grandfather was the original founder, Daniel MacArthur. The mayor of Panguitch is a Houston. The Houston name is very familiar to all the original settlers in Panguitch. The city managers in both towns, Esplin in St. George and Talbot and Panguitch, are both from the pioneer stock. And so the decision-making about place still continues today in those towns. Although St. George is 70,000 and Panguitch was 4,000 on a good day, you can still see that each one of them took the core original stories of place, whether it was battling the landscape, whether it was rallying the troops around a common cause, whether it was character building to battle adversity, and they wove those into the stories that they used to sell themselves as tourism destinations today. I like to think about one of those original pioneers, George Seavey or somebody coming to the town today